Hi, I'm Jay from Real Street Performance. Today we're going to talk about some of the obstacles you may face while changing your fuel injectors or fuel rail. My main concern when switching to an aftermarket fuel injector or a fuel rail is mitigating the fire risk. Fuel is extremely flammable, and if you have a fuel fire in your engine compartment, it's very likely to become a total loss for the vehicle. In this video, we're going to talk about the care and engagement of the injector O-rings and the hardware that's suitable to hold the fuel rail down to either the intake manifold or the cylinder head, depending on the engine. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the hardware used to hold the fuel rail to the intake manifold or cylinder head. This is an OEM Toyota system, and Toyota prescribed a ½ inch of threads going down into this aluminum intake manifold. Now the general rule is you want the width of the bolt times 1 going into steel as far as thread depth, and the width of the bolt times 2 if you're going into aluminum. But the point is you want to have plenty of thread engagement going down into the cylinder head or the intake manifold, because that bolt is all that's holding that fuel rail from being blown off by 45 or 150 psi of fuel pressure. It's your first line of defense against having a fuel leak, is having the correct hardware with the correct length threads going down into the engine or intake manifold to keep the rail secure. Now in the past, I've been on the dyno with a car that had been together for over a year, and the fuel rail fell off the car on the dyno. Now fortunately there wasn't a fire involved, because on a 2JZ, the intake side of the engine is on the opposite side of the exhaust side of the engine. So the fuel is on the cool side of the cylinder head. If you're dealing with a V6 or V8 platform, you're not going to be so lucky. In this particular case, the original installer had less than 2 threads holding the fuel rail onto the intake manifold. How it stayed put for a year, bit of a mystery, but the point is it was wrong during the install. So as you're mocking things up with different height injectors or different caps on the injectors and spacers involved to get things right, if it involves one more trip to the hardware store to get the right length bolts, please make that trip, because you can avoid a fuel fire, which again is going to be catastrophic. So the next subject we're going to talk about is the fuel injector O-rings. The fuel injector O-rings play a critical role because the top side of the injector, they're sealing the fuel pressure into the fuel rail, and on the bottom side of the injector, they're sealing both the engine vacuum and manifold pressure if it's a boosted application. So you want to make sure that those O-rings are intact. So when you're caring for those O-rings, you want to make sure that there are no sharp edges on the fuel rail, that when you install the injector O-ring down into the rail, that it doesn't catch or nick the O-ring. If you nick the O-ring, you have to stop and get another O-ring, and these O-rings aren't going to be something that you're going to purchase from your local hardware store. They're specific because they're fuel compatible. So you want to make sure the O-ring is lubricated, preferably with a silicone lubricant. You can use Vaseline, you could use motor oil, but I prefer using a silicone lubricant, and that will get the injector O-ring sliding into its home with minimal risk of damage. As an illustration to loading the fuel injectors into the rail, I've got 2 different fuel rails here. One of them is a radium rail. This is high quality stuff. It's well engineered, and they offer really neat solutions. They have a really long radius as they get down into the O-ring boss. This other rail is a no-name rail off the internet. We just bought the cheapest one we could find. And if you drag your finger in the O-ring boss, one of them is a nice smooth transition, and the other one has an actual little edge you can catch your fingernail on. And what that's going to do is want to tear that injector O-ring as you load the injectors in. So before you even install your new fuel rail, you're gonna look over it for any metal burrs, make sure that it's clean inside, so on and so forth. But if it's got a little edge here, you're gonna have to be really, really careful to fish those injectors in without damaging an O-ring. When you're installing the injectors into the fuel rail, you wanna make sure that there's enough depth that the O-ring is fully seated down into the rail. So there is some wiggle room where the injector can move up and down in the rail, but what you don't want is to have the O-ring barely covered in the rail. You're asking for trouble. You want to make sure that your O-ring is completely captured down in the fuel rail, and that when the rail is bolted to the engine or intake manifold, no matter how hard you push down on the injector, it still keeps that O-ring away from being able to pop out. Because if you have a fuel pressure surge, like when you let off the gas under high boost, and the fuel pressure just hikes up for a second and it pushes that injector O-ring out, you've got a problem on your hands. So I hope this video has been helpful. I know that this is a pretty elementary bolt-on affair, but again, it offers a lot of safety risk if it's not done correctly. So make these steps small, make sure you care for the O-rings, make sure you're using appropriate hardware, double check your work, and of course double check for leaks because you don't want to deal with a fuel fire. If you have had a horrible experience with a car fire that was related to fuel, let's talk about it in the comments below. I'll catch you next time.